Okay, Doubts Aloud listeners, we promised we would be back to talk about what we're terming here forgeries in the early church in Christian literature. And I will find this for myself a very, very interesting and great topic to do. It's one that a lot of Christians don't really touch into, don't really know about. And so I hope anybody that's listening will use this as a springboard to look into it if it interests you. So we're looking at the whole subject of what's called pseudographic literature in the early church and even in the Bible. So Ed and Francis, presuming you're the real people, you're not fake people here, because that's what it would be like. It would be like having somebody who's pretending to be Ed, Francis, or Andrew, but writing literature. So Ed, could you kick off this whole subject for us?
Well, okay. Do you really stand by the term forgery, or do you think that's a way of making it a bit more dramatic and hyping it up more than it's deserved?
That's a very good question. When just for anybody that sort of doesn't know the sort of ins and outs of this subject, the reason we're talking about forgery in Christian literature in the early church, including maybe in the Bible, it's never really until recently gone by the name forgery. And yet the reason some people are talking like that now is that some deep studies have been done into the early church about what people thought about people who wrote literature under a false name. And so it was all, when I was young, it was called the pseudepigrapher, or pseudographic literature, and that sounds really like highfalutin terminology, doesn't it? But actually, yes. It actually means a falsely attributed work. A false subscription by a name. So we can think of some examples outside of the Bible for sure. Well, Francis, what if being an outsider to this kind of subject that we're just about to launch into? What would you have to say?
I suppose I've always taken the view that where somebody put forward a letter purporting to be from somebody else, they were perhaps not really thinking of what they were doing as forgery. They were thinking of what they were doing as explaining what that person would have said or could have said. But perhaps it had been, perhaps it had been destroyed. So I don't know. I suppose what I think is that did they really intend to deceive people? Perhaps they intended to deceive people and they thought of it as like a white lie that we really, really need people to understand this. And they're really only going to understand this if they think it comes from an authoritative source. So we'd better say that we've got an authoritative source saying it.
Liars for Jesus, as we say.
Sort of, yes.
Sort of, yeah. It's Ed, a couple of comments on this?
Well, I'd be quite keen to hear from you on the historical background to this, but in Jewish and classical literature, before we get into the New Testament. I saw there's this sort of scale of 7. Did you see that? Where you go from literal authorship, scale of 1 straight through to full-on forgery at 7.
Right.
So you go through, like, dictation is nearest literal authorship. Then the supposed author asks someone to say it's a letter, write the letter, and says, I want you to say this, that, and the other, and then they back off. Then it's posthumous. Posthumous, what's all that? Posthumous authorship, where the key figure dies and their kind of followers finish a letter that they knew they were intending to write. So this is now the middle of the scale. Then apprenticeship authorship, which is also after the person's died, but their apprentice they left behind is sufficiently au fait with them that they can authoritatively write in their name. Then the next one, well, it's called honourable pseudography, but I'd call it fan fiction kind of style. And then the last one is full-on forgery.
Right.
So is that a thing?
No.
Okay, good.
I think the issue is this. The issue is this: is that, okay, if I could try and do a broad outline just before the sort of New Testament era, and even in the early church era, it's basically absolutely indisputable fact, as opposed to even any kind of gradients and everything else, that basically literature was written by people who weren't who they said they were. Okay, and so you got like the Book of Enoch, was meant to be Enoch's, words, and some people sort of mooted, well, it must have, I don't know, somehow been written before writing was written in tablets coming through the ark and all of this stuff from Enoch, and then it's the Book of Enoch. But actually it was somebody way back in this sort of, I don't know, mix of 2nd century BC and then developed a bit even past New Testament times, the Book of Enoch, evidently. And it's not Enoch, it's just his name. And people have heard of the Book of Enoch. And there's loads and loads and loads of literature like that basically takes a character from the past, particularly in that era. Daniel is widely recognized to be that. It's not a 6th century person that wrote it, but it is purported to be by a 6th century person called Daniel. And most, obviously, fundamentalists all say, no, it really was Daniel, and conservatives would be split and admit the evidence that it's not. So this is the general feeling, and there's other literature outside the Bible that has all of this stuff going on. It's so well known, it's just like a cottage industry of literature, and it wasn't by the person they say it was. When the New Testament was being written, and then into the 2nd century, 3rd century, there are stacks and stacks of books that are purported to be written by the apostles, by other named people that were before their time. And you just have this literature, the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, and all of that. And everybody across the board knows that those claims are false, and it was Christians writing them. This is the interesting thing. I mean, it's not like you've got bad people, so-called, or secular people doing this. You've got Christian people, in one sense, writing in, and there's reasons for this, and so that's what we'll get into a bit later. What are the reasons for why somebody would write something in that name? And then we'll also touch in, of course, which is the key thing for anyone listening to this show, is there any of that going on in the New Testament itself?
Yeah. But the trouble is, in the 2nd century, it can't be any of the others except the full-on 7-level forgery. Whereas if a letter appears in the 1st century, then you can start claiming, if you want to be traditional and adhere to, say, James or something.
Yes.
You could say, well, James was he didn't speak Greek as a young man, but maybe he learnt a bit, or maybe he asked someone to write it and speaking his Aramaic, and the person wrote it in Greek. You can get away with trying to stick to the party line that James is the genuine author, with all these kind of wriggles,
because of the time span. Well, I mean, there's again, I mean, Bart Ehrman's probably one of the most well-known people to have ever done masses of work in the English language. A lot of it sourced from translations of German studies in this, and it's fascinating. I mean, he's got. I've got the audiobook version, which is 28 hours, and it's looking at this and I've listened to it probably 3 times in the last sort of 10 years. And you just, it's just so detailed on so much of the sort of thing you were just saying, Ed. And it goes into all of these reasons why there's a problem. And he calls it forgery because of the early church evidence that, if it was spotted, it would have been, it was a condemnable offense, almost a bit like stealing post is today, Yeah. And if someone stole post today and they said, oh, they're just taking it as a friend honorably, it just doesn't wash. You're actually committing a grave offense in today's standards. The same with forging your name on a letter. And so all this stuff about honorary and all this stuff, I mean, he goes into it in such detail that it's hard to accept how on earth did this view come up in the church that there was this sort of honorary school of Pauline thought where he's died, but we'll just carry on writing as he would have, and in his name, and there's no problem, it's acceptable. A lot of progressive Christians do accept that. It's the fundamentalists that don't and sit on the same line as Bart Ehrman on this, which is interesting. They both agree that if there's a forgery in the New Testament, it was a lie and the person was deceptive, not that it's an honor, and so that's why the fundamentalists don't accept any of the evidence for forgeries in the New Testament.
Well, that's quite a common theme, isn't it? Yeah. That in many ways, atheists will have more in common with fundamentalists than they do with liberal Christians.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I see this again and again. The critical scholars and the fundamentalists do also have the same bed because they both understand what the text is saying, except like say Genesis, it seems to be talking about this dome of the earth and the fundamental, literalists don't go that far. Maybe some do, but the young earth and Adam and Eve and everything else, they say, well, this is why it happened. And the liberal will say, no, this is why it's a myth, but they do understand what it's saying, whereas the progressives sort of try to have a middle ground, and they do this with the forgeries. So when we get onto New Testament books that seem to be this, it's the progressive Christian now that's in a really, really tough spot, because the fundamentalists will say, aha, told you, we don't accept that evidence that it wasn't Paul, for example. Yeah. And the progressive will say, well, it was all honor, it was all those other scales that you said, but what it wasn't was forgery in the sense of deception, which is the real key here. Forgery is now being used because that's what it would have been if spotted, and it's negative.
And just before we move on, the kind of right at the other end, this sort of dictation or a kind of delegated authorship.
Yeah.
Do fundamentalists sort of take one of those options?
Well, yes. What's really, really common, other than sort of citing, like the more progressive Christians say, well, just say, just pick out, say Colossians, I, Paul, it says, it's widely seen in the academic sort of study of this, that Colossians wasn't written by Paul for so many reasons. And we can go into some of those. And so that's, oh, sorry. What was your question now? Going on that.
Well, okay. So take Colossians, say.
Yeah.
Presumably, some of the phraseology is different from the rest of Paul.
Yeah.
And so the fundamentalist or conservative, I think it's better know.
Yes.
Would say, well, Paul probably asked someone to write the letter.
Yeah.
And the actual scribe used a bit of phraseology that Paul wouldn't have done if he'd sat down and done it himself.
Yeah, it's commonly used to sort of have when Bart Ehrman sort of in detail for his book, which sort of collates a lot of other materials on this, would say that basically we're down to, do you want to have evidence or do you not want to have evidence? You want to have at the end of the day, he would say it's theological romanticism to argue that, basically, as opposed to the evidence. He's saying, basically on the one end, you have a mound of evidence that Christians wrote under a false name because everybody accepts that when it's outside the Bible. You have virtually zero evidence that you have lots of evidence that you did have a dictator, an Amantius, I think it's called, or something like that.
Yes, that's right.
Whereas, but that's like a headmaster at school just reading out what he wants, and then you've got the secretary typing it. But what the argument sometimes is that the Greek, say, of 1 Peter or 2 Peter is so massively different between each other that you've either got the headmaster saying, I'm off for lunch now, and my thoughts, to write off the letter and just say what I think. That's what the fundamentalists seem to be saying. But then in that case, the secretary is the writer, really, because it's just saying, you know what I think, why do I even have to bother looking at it? Whereas a dictator is like, and they type it, and that's dictation. That's not writing. And sometimes the argument is that to try and express how different some of these Greeks are between Paul and Paul, it's like, okay, because it's not just that, it's theology, it's long sentences, it's words that were much more common in the 2nd century. All of this stuff happens to be thrown at a dictated approach doesn't actually wash when looked at detail.
Yeah.
And but it's a nice idea. It's like, I got John to write it for me, and I was a bit ill, so I asked Rupert to do it, and you know what I mean. And it's like that's the kind of feeling you get. But there's not much evidence for that,
right?
At that level, but there is for pure dictation. Yes, most of Paul's letters were probably,
yes, yeah. There's a famous bit where he says, "This is my actual own hand."
Yes, which is really ironic, by the way, because how on earth in copies of the letters of Scripture are you meant to know that? It would have been just the one-off original. And by the way, that's very, very interesting. I'm not sure where that passage is, but forgeries did that kind of thing themselves, by the way. So in later things that aren't in the Bible, you had the 12 disciples all writing this document, and they were saying, now watch out for for forgeries. We write this in our own hand or something. So it's actually there's things that might be giveaways that a book in the New Testament is in fact very cleverly dropping things to make you think that it is the real deal when it's actually not. So it's like I protest too much, and so bring the parchments, is a classic one, where it says, oh, don't forget those parchments there in the room, bring them with you. That's so detailed, you think that must be the author, but actually that's the kind of trope that a forger would do, try and make it a bit more personal and detailed. Like that, so don't forget the microphone, Ed, that I left there on Tuesday last week, and it was like, wow, so Andrew must have been there,
It's a bit like some of these telephone scams where they'll say, don't tell me what your code is, but key in your code. So they're trying to present themselves as like having the same security as you would expect. Yes. From the bank, so they're sort of saying like, oh, don't do something that would compromise your security. Don't tell me what your code is. Just key it in. Don't tell me.
Yeah.
So they're trying to make you feel that
because you might think, oh, well, that must mean they're the bank, when actually they're actually doing the double clever, and that's what some of the people who wrote under a false name Christian literature. And when I say Christian literature, I'm not necessarily meaning anything in the Bible at this point. I'm just saying in these later points, it's amazing how they did things like that.
Yeah.
And therefore don't be the one thing that's made, like as you said, Francis, that's made you go, well, this must be the real deal. How would they know? When we get to 2 Peter, there's a fascinating passage on just this example. So,
okay, well, should we do that now?
Oh, what, 2 Peter? Okay, well, I've got this summary of a Christian book that had this a summary of when we talk about the relevance. So anyone listening to this show right now thinking, I've never really thought about who may have written the documents of the New Testament other than who it says it was, or particularly the letters or the epistles. So anyway, the summary goes like this: of the 27 writings that were added to the Jewish scriptures by Christians in antiquity as the New Testament, only 7 are unanimously accepted by modern scholars as genuinely carrying the name of their original author. The 7 are the following epistles of Paul: Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon, or however people say it. The authenticity of several texts is disputed, especially Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians and 1 Peter. The rest of the writings contained in the New Testament were all probably not written by the persons whose alleged authorship of these documents originally justified their inclusion in the canon. How well put is that? I like that. Yeah. So that's it. So that's like a sum up of current scholarship today in the 21st century on this issue.
Well, so should we ask the question, is that in the Bible?
Is that really in the Bible?
We did not follow cleverly invented stories when we told you about the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. For he received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him
Thank
on the
you,
sacred
Ed.
mountain.
Well, how on earth? What's going on here? Is this in the Bible? Well, it clearly is in the Bible because you've just read it from the Bible. And,
Perhaps it shouldn't be.
Perhaps it shouldn't be is the question. So this taps in. Why have we done this verse? Well, it's because obviously that passage in 2 Peter is clearly claiming eyewitness testimony as Peter, you know.
Yes. Well, the book, the letter starts, Simon Peter, servant of the Apostle of Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Isn't it plain? The most natural fundamentalist reader would say. And isn't it anybody that's really in the church reading the New Testament would just say, all right, okay, well, why doubt anything that it says? You throw the book of Enoch at them, they probably would, but not 2 Peter. And because it's, you know, the big question. So we're using 2 Peter as the example here of it's absolutely indisputable that people wrote in the name of Peter outside of the Bible, the Gospel of Peter. There's the Apocalypse of Peter. There's several other things of Peter. I mean, there's Bart Ehrman says it is a cottage industry of Peter books. You know, it was just what Christians did. They wrote in the name of Peter. So the big question is, and the most important one for any Christian is, did that false subscription of people writing in the name of Peter actually get into the Bible? And if it did, what does it mean? How does it affect the faith? What does it mean? And what's really going on there? And how do we work around this? And so the reason I picked 2 Peter is because overwhelmingly it's the book that is basically, almost in academic scholarship, it would be indisputable that it wasn't written by Peter for so much evidence. And fundamentalists will just deny the evidence, like young earth creationists deny biology and evidence of science in the mainstream. It's the same thing. Progressives would accept that 2 Peter is, even N.T. Wright accepts that Peter probably, more than likely, I've just read a quote the other day, more than likely didn't write 2 Peter, you know, because of the evidence. So the Christian believers are in a very difficult position because, you know, there's acceptance of the evidence and then there's the reasoning of how do we cope with that in the Bible? How do we deal with it? And so that's why we're using 2 Peter here. So any of you two comment more on this? Yeah.
Well, this may be something that you think in any event we should approach further down the line, but I suppose my reaction is perhaps, you know, rather arguing against ourselves, playing devil's advocate here a bit. I mean, why would a forger get that wrong? Because isn't the thing that the forger is writing from a time when the scriptures are out there and they are, so why wouldn't they get it right? They would presumably know what they should be saying, and why are they saying something different from what they should be saying? We haven't quite pulled it apart. We haven't quite pulled the problems apart yet. So
no,
maybe that's
but what are you actually saying in essence, though? Are you saying that what did the forger of it, assuming that Peter did not write 2 Peter in the New Testament, what are you saying that he did wrong?
That he ascribed this voice coming out of the clouds to the time when the apostles or the disciples were with Jesus up the mountain, which I think would be the time of the Transfiguration. I'm not fantastically good on all my Bible timelines, but that's my memory. Whereas there's no reference to that at the time of the Transfiguration. And the only time that we see those words, or words very similar, is at the time of Jesus's baptism. So
they're similar up the mountain, but if you want it word for word, you need to go to the baptism.
Right. Yeah. What does he? What?
Okay, let's
supposedly said up the mountain.
Edward can do.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll quickly find it. I'm using Mark because of the tradition we're told is that Mark wrote the teachings of Peter. And this is my son whom I love, listen to him up the mountain.
Right.
But if you want your actual word for word the same, you have to discount Mark and go to Matthew. And there you get exactly the same phrase. Immediately after the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist, the voice comes from heaven and says, "This is my son whom I love. with him I am well pleased.
Right.
So you've got a point there, Francis, because if the forgery person is relying on the Gospels, they should know that they've made a mistake. I don't know what you think, Andrew.
Well, I haven't really sort of at that particular level, because I'm sort of more sort of aware of all the sort of bigger issues around the notion of false, people writing under a false name. These are more of the details of what they said and didn't say. I suppose we can cover this a bit more as we go through a bit more of 2 Peter then, in terms of why people think that it was written in the 2nd century, and probably is the last written book in the New Testament, and that it isn't Peter writing it. And yet, yes, like you said, if these that's another question, isn't it? What has the author given away by accident? What has the author maybe got wrong? And why?
Yeah.
The main point I was wanting to stress at this point is why. What's the reason for someone writing in the name of Peter, pretending that they are Peter? And like the person who wrote the Gospel of Peter was clearly saying, I am Peter, and I'm giving this, and it wasn't. And so what's the reason for that at this stage is the actual point. And you covered right at the beginning of this podcast this sort of scale of what Christians actually say about, once you admit this, so 2 Peter just say once it's admitted it wasn't Peter. I know that even though N.T. Wright would say that it wasn't written by Peter, I don't think he would say it was a lie and forgery and deception and deceiving the readership, which is what Bart Ehrman would say. And Dan Wallace, for example, who's a conservative sort of textual critic, he says that if so he would probably say but Peter did write to Peter, because he would say that if it was a false subscription, the author would be lying and is talking all about truth, and what's the reason for that? Now, there's a very good Greek backdrop to why someone would do this, by the way, in the early church, and I can get into that later. Very good reason, and that's one of the recent things that I'd learned about this when I was researching it. Was the reasons why you can lie for Christ, in a sense, and you can in the early church. There's a backdrop in Greek thought and the early church thought that you could do this. There's actually texts all about it, and so we can get there.
Yeah,
but, okay.
Well, I was just going to put forward a possible suggested answer to my own question.
Yes,
which you could perhaps deal with later. If you think there's any merit in it, which is that perhaps the writer, because at that stage there wasn't a settled canon, was referencing some other work which has since become lost. So the writer presumably didn't know exactly, or couldn't have known exactly, what was going to end up in the canon, so may have had access to some other document which has subsequently become lost to us, where it was said that these exact words were used when Jesus was up the mountain. That's my suggested
for that particular issue. Yeah, probably true. I mean, the sources that they were drawing from, and hearsay and adaptions, and different sayings that had dropped down. There's loads of this stuff outside the Bible, even sayings of Jesus that aren't in it, that people thought Jesus said or didn't say, or is coming from here. So all of that was going on. So I don't think there's probably going to be an answer for that. But Ed, you were going to go through more sort of evidence on 2 Peter then.
Well, I thought I'd do a little bit of a diversion.
Yes.
While we're on 2 Peter, and that is, I want to kind of tick off one of the chapters in our 50 Arguments for God book.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yep.
Because it's material on setting the canon, and we covered that in episode 26.
Yep.
And it's quite interesting. They do the sort of standard stuff, and they conclude Christians are on solid ground in affirming that these 27 books belong in the New Testament. And this whole forgery thing would blow that out of the water. That they are maybe they belong, but they're there through deception and trickery rather than because of they really should belong. The criteria for acceptance in the canon, I think that the author gives, it's actually Bloomberg, who's quite a well-known figure.
Yeah.
He gives 3, which I think is very standard amongst all kind of scholarship, that things were accepted because of the apostolic authority, because of the teachings in the books were orthodox, and because they were generally accepted. So the apostolic authorship is the thing that is doesn't count when it's snuck in as a forgery.
I mean, isn't that a bit self-supporting?
Yes, I was going to say that. It is.
I don't think he's making an argument. He's just saying this is what happened. This is what people were doing when they. He might be smuggling in an argument, but
the reality, though, is that I think Francis was saying that the reality is, I suppose, as theology is developing, and this is the way we're going. If it doesn't support it, we won't use it, and if it does, so it's a bit like. I don't know, whoever the winners were, I suppose, could have some decisions in what was in. You know, surprising that the Book of James got in some senses, because of how different it is, and seems to be in contrary to Paul's thoughts, in a really quite clear way. In some sense, there's a sort of a clash there, but
Isn't that the one that Martin Luther called a right strawy epistle?
Epistle of straw, yes, exactly. He didn't want it out, but he certainly wanted it at the back. Maybe.
So Bloomberg does accept these sort of issues. He mentions James and the problem of the faith and works in James, and he mentions 2 Peter as the only passing reference to authorship problems. But he just says, the church were wise and got it right in the end, and therefore the books belong.
Yes, and I suppose this is the thing where it comes back to when I listened to Bart Ehrman on it and Daniel Wallace, who are both opposing, like one's sort of, agnostic atheist Bible scholar and the other's a fundamentalist Bible scholar, really. But they're both very serious critical scholars. And Daniel Wallace and Bart Ehrman totally agree that the evidence of the early church is not all this wishy-washy honouring, like I said, a school of thought and tribute to the author and all of this sort of stuff. It's simply forgery, and it's simply deceptive, trying to give your authority. Because look, if I wrote a book and it was all about something and and I sort of put it out there in some major bookstore, it would probably be one, no copies sold and at the back. Okay, but if I put N.T. Wright on there, and that's one major reason, the authority. When this splits into my diversity thing, which is all of the different disputes in the early church which were happening. People wanted to sort of settle things and write a book and say, well, no, Paul would have said this, and so they wrote in the name of Paul to give that theology. And Paul, if they had written these books, may have died on the spot with shock. I wouldn't have said that, or maybe I would have said that. But he'd probably say, "What are you doing, pretending to be me?" Because that's where the evidence and the quotes in the early church seem to come from. They condemned. They found the guy that wrote 3 Corinthians, by the way, doing it. There's a 3rd Corinthians, by the way. It's not in the New Testament, but some early church people did like it. But I think they found the guy that did it, and so he actually said what the progressive said. He said, "I'm doing it in honor of Paul. I'm doing it because this is what he would have said." But they excommunicated him as a serious punishment, And so you got these stories and texts about this, and all of them basically come down on the line that if the church had spotted that Peter did not write to Peter, they would have not put it in the Bible. But because they ultimately believed it was, but it was disputed back then. People did think, this is a bit different, bit strange. And it relies on Jude, and Jude seemed to be a bit different and a bit strange. And a much later document, not Jude, again, another false one in the name of Jude. The brother of Jesus. And so all of this was going on back in the early church. They were discussing it about 2 Peter. So it didn't have an easy ride even then. So
so what? Going back a bit, what the passage I read
Yes.
about eyewitnesses and things, why was that a particular interest to you?
Oh, well, that's of interest to me because what surprised me when I was going through the 28-hour book of Bart Ehrman on this, which is not, by the way, the book that the short one called Forged, who's popularized the name forgery now, because it's like, as Daniel Wallace says, it really is what the early church, they condemned this literature as forgeries if they spotted it. So, but like I said, when I was young, it was all pseudographic. Oh, that's a pseudograph. Yes, Pauline school of thought. You know, it wasn't actually Paul, but it was just like we extend it by his friends and co-workers, you know, and all of that stuff was going on when I was young. And so forgery sort of slams that down and says, no, that's not what the early church would have done if they'd spotted it. I'm interested because... the question you're asking, Ed, was because I noticed that lots and lots of quotes from later books that everyone says were Christian forgeries. In other words, you know, they said things like that eyewitness thing. I mean, there's one great big chapter of Bart Ehrman's book where you get bored with the quotes of false forged literature saying, I, we, this, we saw that, I did this, I went up there, you know, and it's like, the writers are Christian people who are lying, you know. It's just what they did. And it's like, I got bored of this. I thought you didn't need to do so many, Bart, you know. I was thinking, but he was making the point that he was talking about the we passages in Acts, by the way, at that point, to make the point that you know, that's why people think that Luke, who's attributed to Acts, wrote Acts, because of these we passages. We did this, we did that, we did the other. But he pointed out that that's exactly what people did, then slipped that kind of language into their texts. And time after time after time, you realize that when I started to see, if anyone says they're an eyewitness, I tend to doubt it now based on all this other stuff I've read. You know? And so it's like, so the fundamentalists will read that and say, look, this has to be by Peter because he said he was up the mountain and we saw this. But when you can't dismiss the fact that loads of people have said that sort of thing. And so one of the things about forgeries is that you do that. You have you noticed the Gospels don't do any of the I's? I did this, I saw this. Or we talked about Jesus. I was up there and I did this and I went along. They could have been, but they weren't. They were always like some mysterious, anonymous sort of, I don't know, narrator, you know, like
an observer.
Like an observer.
I mean, I've raised this with believers, you know, and of course you always get, I don't know, kind of snubbed. And I think what they've come back saying is, oh, this was a kind of standard way of writing, and I forget who is it. Tractatus? Does that sound right? Somebody, or it might be
Tacitus.
Tacitus. That's right. Yeah, I'm hopeless. I'm hopeless. Yes. And they say, oh, well, he wrote about things, and he never used the first person or the second person plural. I mean, I looked into that, and you know, to my mind, there was an answer to that, but I can't remember what the answer was. But you know, they're quite adamant that there's nothing odd about all these supposed biographies, or you know, with an autobiographical element in them, biographies of Jesus by eyewitnesses. They're just always adamant that there's nothing odd about the fact that they never use the first person. Plural or singular, even though you do find it in Acts.
Yes, but they make hay when the sun shines with the
yes, that's right. Where it's all like, oh, you know, here.
That's right. But and so as soon as you go, we got a we passage. Oh my gosh, thank goodness that locates in an eyewitness history, because the Gospels, unfortunately, are like J.K. Rowling writing the Harry Potter books. They're the anonymous, all-knowing, omniscient author. How did you know what Jesus did and said in all of these private places?
So when he was praying in
when he went to pray on his own, and went to
to
talk with the pilot or whatever, you've got people saying, well, it must have been the guards that were in line with the Christians who went out and said, do you know what Jesus just said? And then the writers try and make a note, and then, you know, it's just not what would have happened. It's so easy to see that it's an anonymous narrator, and who can actually, I mean, it's even argued, I think even Mike Licona argues that in fact Suetonius and everything, they kind of make up the speeches of people because they weren't there to hear them, so they just made them up,
Yes,
know,
it's a literary technique.
Literary technique
to summarise the sort of the person in your biography.
And it just so happens that in the Book of John, everybody sounds like the author. So it's like because that's what you're doing. You're just writing. The author is sort of either making it up or just summing up what they think the person may have said in that circumstance. So even in the writing of a gospel, you're getting that going on. And I'm not saying the Gospels are forged in the same way, because it doesn't say, I, Matthew, wrote this. Those names in the Gospels were put to them. People needed a name, and particularly when other books were coming out. So we thought, we need to throw names in here. That's why it says the Gospel according to, but they didn't write that. The authors didn't write the Gospel. You wouldn't do that, would you? You write a Gospel and then say the Gospel according to Andrew. And I would write it. Somebody would say, "Oh, this looks like Andrew wrote it, so we'll put that."
There is the end of John, Gospel of John. So this is the disciple who testifies to these things, who wrote them down.
Yes, that's right. But
we know that his testimony is true, not my testimony is true.
Yeah, that's true. But then it's a group of we that are saying that, who are writing in chapter 21. We think, or something like that. It's we. So first of all, there's a we going on in chapter 21, and then they're referring to someone else. And so I think the argument is that they're either making the claim. Bart Ehrman would say, for example, that whoever's writing chapter 21, he thinks wrote the whole John. So in other words, it's not John, because they refer to the person who wrote these things, which is probably an earlier claim that there was some kind of document that John wrote, and then this later author compiled it or whatever. Other people just think chapter 21 was literally written by other people, and is referring to the previous, before chapter 1, as maybe going back to it doesn't name him as John, does it? It's the famous beloved disciple, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
And of course that is disputed all over the place to exactly who it is, so we're not really getting that close to who we're talking about here. It's just tradition that it was John. Oh, sorry, I've forgotten to mention before we go on, Ed, is that one of the big things about this is that no one could write back then with any evidence. The great Greek of say James, or which isn't fantastically great apparently, but it's certainly say 1 Peter and 2 Peter. There's certainly good Greek rhetorical literature writers, and to Peter, who was unschooled and coming as a fisherman, just wouldn't have been in the culture of being able to write such Greek. So that's one of the main reasons that's argued that Peter and anybody didn't write this stuff. Paul did, but he dictated anyway. So got dictators to write it. Dictated it, to be written. Yeah.
So when there's a dearth in the letters of historical details about Jesus. This is one of my things.
Yes.
So Paul hardly says anything. He's got the Last Supper, the quote of Jesus. It's the only quote of Jesus in the whole of Paul.
Yeah.
And tiny little snippets, about 4 of them that you could say.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah.
And the transfiguration that we read in 2 Peter, that's good. Independent attestation outside of the Gospels of a gospel event.
Yes.
But you're saying, probably not.
With all the other evidence, like I said, just to go a bit further, like 2 Peter references Jude, and it seems to be, if you read Jude and 2 Peter together, you realize it's the same thing. Something's going on, it's a bit fishy. It's really odd that Peter would sit down and literally plagiarize Jude, who's meant to be the brother of Jesus in terms of tradition. And but Jude has seen to be highly it seems to be in a setting, so 2 Peter is quoting Jude. Jude was highly controversial back then anyway, because it quotes Enoch, and some sort of extreme Christians then did want Enoch in the Bible, and others didn't want Jude in because it quoted Enoch. Jude has all this stuff that Peter then picks up and sort of revamps. 2 Peter picks up and revamps, and yet the evidence for Jude being late, way past Peter's death, is so strong that 2 Peter copies it and revamps it, is showing that this author isn't the eyewitness, is what we're saying, to give this eyewitness evidence. So if somebody goes to 2 Peter and says, look, here's external evidence that Peter was an eyewitness outside the New Testament, doesn't actually wash based on how 2 Peter is saying stuff and quoting stuff and utilizing stuff. Another element about 2 Peter is it references the delay of the parousia, which is like the second coming basically hasn't happened. And it says, ever since the fathers died, everything has gone on. Now, it's the most natural reason is this is the fathers of like the church, a reference to the apostles, and the author is kind of slipping a bit because he says your apostles say this instead of we apostles. And that's argued that a generation or 2 or 3 have gone on, so maybe we're in mid-second century and everything is going on, and where's this imminent second coming you're talking about? And that absolutely fits a second century writer, whereas it wasn't just saying this is going to happen, because it seems to be airing the problem that it's gone on. And if it was imminent, you wouldn't be saying, well, don't worry, it's not going to happen until the second century. So you've got all of this problem in 2 Peter, being aware of this we're saying 2,000 years it still hasn't happened, but they were saying a second century. Where is it? You know? So that's another strong reason why 2 Peter wasn't written by Peter, who died, traditionally in the 60s.
He was a Nero.
Yeah, exactly. So we're talking like 60 years later, probably.
Yeah.
And not only that, but the Greek is different. There's just so many things going on in 2 Peter with the references to Jude that's why N.T. Wright, with his integrity, has to say it wasn't written by Peter. And so then we get onto the other era of how then do we make it acceptable for Christians if it wasn't written by Peter and the author wasn't up the mountain witnessing Jesus? How do you do that? So that's what we could probably talk about now.
What do you mean? How do you do it? Just
how does somebody in church sitting and reading 2 Peter? They can't use the argument you just made if they're doing apologetics. Like if you are at Unbelievable Conference and they said, look, people say there's no evidence of this, but look, we've got 2 Peter. It says he was a witness up the thing. That's independent. But then someone says even N.T. Wright is embarrassed on stage going, oh, it wasn't actually written by Peter, so we can't really use that. You've got Christians who are then going to fall out with each other on exactly how to use evidence now for apologetics. So
how does N.T. Wright deal with it?
Well, I could only project what he would by summing him up as more of a progressive Christian and more, liberal compared with the fundamentalists of, say, the Ken Hams of this world and all of that lot. Even Daniel Wallace, they are a much stronger ground. The sort of, say, the more like Bloomberg, for example. I would say that he might play the language of, oh, this is sort of disputed, but I think he would have to say, I know that Bloomberg's quite conservative evangelical, would have to say, I don't think he would go for the this thing that you were mentioning earlier about the honoring, and it's just a school of thought. A lot of the fundamentalists do agree with the fact that it would have been a deceptive lie. You cannot talk about truth but lie about who you are. You can't do it. And
I think I've had a go with this with
yes, okay,
2 Peter,
to
see what people say, and they're saying, oh, there's good arguments that it's genuine.
Oh, right.
Without saying what they are.
Well, there are. Well, thing is, I've looked into that quite a lot, and of course, the problem is that you've got. This is the thing. I mean, have you ever heard, Francis, that people say to you, "Oh, you've just got a bias, or you just can't accept it because you're an atheist"? Yeah. Well, it's the other way around. There's a theological reason why you cannot have forgeries in the New Testament, and the question, what Bart Ehrman puts is like, look, I use this as a historian. He says, I use the tools on 3 Corinthians that's not in the Bible as on 2 Corinthians. Yeah. And so you go to 3 Corinthians and you use all the tools of historical data and you say, look, Paul did not rub. First, the fact, I believe they caught the guy that did 3 Corinthians, but just say there's other ones. And you say, look, the Gospel of Peter clearly wasn't Peter. Here's the reasons. All the fundamentalists applaud. Yay! It's a forgery. It wasn't in the Bible. Complete forgery, liar, deception. 2 Peter, no way. That's not allowed. That would be a lie in the Bible. We can't have that because God wrote it, basically. You see the difference? Whereas if 2 Peter, funny enough, was pushed out of the Bible back then in the 2nd century, all the fundamentalists would be saying, yeah, they probably agree with all the evidence.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Be saying just shows how right they were.
How
exactly they were.
How wonderful. Of course it was plagiarizing off Jude, and of course whatever. And so because Jude has to go with 2 Peter as well as late and pseudonymous because of the things. And so what I find in there is that you've got, like you say, the evidence doesn't actually come up very clearly, or it's very weak because they just deny it by theology. You cannot have a liar in the Bible, so therefore we will look the other way and deny the evidence. But historians who come to it could be, I mean, some of them are very strong, passionate Christian historians, and they still say 2 Peter is forged. They may not use the word, they'll say it's a pseudepigraphic literature, but because it just sounds less offensive, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So, but we all, Thomas, it's human nature. We've got to be a bit careful because we all do this sort of thing, don't we?
We all have our
biases, that's why I mentioned the bias for all of us in one sense. But remember,
I'm convinced that life evolved through natural processes.
Yeah,
not because there's any evidence that shows that. It's just that it has to have done to fit with the rest of what I believe.
Right, I see what you mean. So, I mean, I suppose we could have our own. We have our own. But if you start with, that's like the Young Earth creationism on the website with Ken Ham. It's like basically, if you come up with evidence that doesn't fit our story as we read it in the Bible, then we dismiss it. Basically, it says it's not. That's not a quote. That's the essence.
Yes, that's the working.
So you come up with any evidence that 2 Peter is forged. We're afraid to say, I'm sorry, but we dismiss it.
Yes.
Go and do
we've
your
got
work
good
on
reasons to think otherwise.
Yes, but go and do your work on the Gospel of Peter, because we will agree with you then. And so what I would love to see, say 3 Corinthians or whatever it was. I'd love to see somebody defend that as Paul, because that's what they're doing. They're doing the same thing, that's not in the Bible. I'd love to see them defend something as, but they don't. Nobody does. And it's like, it's really weird how when it comes to the Bible, and Bart Ehrman points that out, it's so strange, really, that when you put the same evidence to the test with the Bible, unfortunately, the evidence is dismissed because that's theology doing the dismissing, not he believes the evidence,
Yeah.
And so, but anyway, this should be a springboard for anyone that's interested to actually go away and do more research and listen. And I recommend the big tome that Bart Ehrman does, not the short book called Forged. It's called Counter Forgery and Polemics in Early Christian Church, and it does all the books up to the 4th century, or most of them. And with which there's
we'll try and get that in the show notes.
Yeah.
Now I had a go because my ears pricked up. I read 2 Peter because I knew it'd be something we'd be concentrating on. And there's a passage right at the end which really made me think. And that's where the author, we'll call him Peter,
yes,
refers to Paul, and he says what Paul has written to you earlier, which doesn't seem to be in keeping at all with what he's saying. And also says that Paul wrote scripture. The letters of Paul are scripture. So it's just astounding. So that those are 2 separate things. So did Paul at all talk about how the return of Jesus is being delayed and we need a lot of patience and the Lord's patience in it not happening so soon and all that sort of thing? I don't think.
No. Well, yes and no, and that depends on now coming into another forgery, which is the much more disputed one, but certainly good evidence for it, that 2 Thessalonians is actually not Paul, because in fact the theology of the end times seems to be different, because Paul seemed to say, and in Romans as well, the day is at hand, it's near, it's imminent, and in 1 Thessalonians he's saying, it's basically going to happen soon. Keep watch. In other words, there's nothing really to take place. It's just, you're just waiting for it to happen. So look up, basically. And then suddenly we get into 2 Thessalonians and he's saying, unless those think that the day of the Lord is at hand, you're wrong, basically, because these things are going to happen first. First of all, the man of sin is going to set himself up in the temple, and then this is going to happen and that's going to happen. And then, so it will be the gathering, but basically don't be put off by funny enough, he says in 2 Thessalonians, even if someone wrote a letter in our name saying such things, that it's at hand almost. That's the gist. Yeah. And you think, hang around, Paul is often given the idea the time is short and it's at hand and it's near, and he doesn't seem to give a list of things that's going to happen, like this man of sin in the temple, and you have to wait for this to happen and what's holding him back. He's now telling his readers, actually, it's not going to happen instantly or imminently or just without any other signs. And so some people would say that that's one reason why 2 Thessalonians was actually by a later writer who's changing the theology of the second coming, because it probably wasn't happening, and therefore we tie into 2 Peter's delay issue going on. And so we have possibly a clash of Paul with Paul there with Thessalonians.
Yes, yeah. So, well, here's the passage.
Yeah.
Bear in mind that our Lord's patience, I think Lord in context means Jesus, that our Lord's patience means salvation, just as our dear brother Paul also wrote to you with the wisdom that God gave him. He writes the same way in all his letters, speaking in them of these matters. His letters contain some things which are hard to understand, which ignorant and unstable people distort, as they do the other scriptures, their own destruction. So he's saying the whole theme of Paul, all his letters, has this delay theme, which
isn't true.
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. I mean, he's very much the time is short, the time is near. You think it's going to happen. I mean, there are some differences, like, what did he think? What's the time span for saying what Israel was going to do in the time? But it was all genuinely, I think, about to happen. And it's like, even 1 Thessalonians, he thought that people that had died weren't his group. He is going to be caught up in 1 Thessalonians, but we shall be caught up. That's him. He hasn't died for thousands of years or even 20. So it does change even in Paul's writings. It seems to be hanging on a bit. By the time you get to perhaps Philippians, he's thinking it's time for my departure now, which is more the death departure as opposed to the end times. And so even Paul was probably struggling in himself with this. But you're right that Peter there is quoting something that isn't quite fitting. And speaking of it as if, doesn't it sound like a 2nd century look back to Paul?
Yeah, of course. Because if you're saying this is written by Peter, this has got to be about AD 62 at the absolute latest. And Paul hardly written his corpus by then. And even his earliest ones would be a lot less than 10 years old.
You're right. And it couldn't be gathered to be scripture and for people to say some people misunderstand it. I mean, what are we talking about here? We're talking about a few occasional letters that were written in the 50s, and it's got this great perspective that makes perfect sense by 2nd century. And it makes no sense by 5 years, 10 years later.
Yeah.
Oh, one thing I hadn't mentioned to both of you was this backdrop to why forgeries in the early church were all the evidence is that if caught they were condemned, like a serious situation. I mean, there's so many literatures out there that you could research on that, but there's also a backdrop of concept of what's called the noble lie in the backdrop of Greek culture. This is what really surprised me in my recent research, and also lots of quotes from early church fathers on this. And it really gave an insight to how Christians could actually write something without thinking it was the most grievous sin in deceiving who the author was. So have you got any thoughts on that before I mention it?
This lying for Jesus theme is the only way to make sense of the data.
Well, we get it in modern apologetics, we feel, don't we? And so, but back then there really was a sort of an idea that actually, particularly in some of the Greek thought as well, that you could have this, that if lying brings, there's either, we do it quite a lot anyway, the way we think about lying. There's protective lying and there's
white lies. Lies. Yeah.
Well, white lies and also protection lies. So there's the idea of, did you, was it you that committed that crime or whatever, and you did do it, but you lie. So you're saying no. Or there's the one that's Anne Frank, have you got Jews hidden behind the wall? No. And and some of these church fathers actually quote so much in the Bible about this sort of protective lying that you think, gosh, I wonder why it ever came to the point that all lies are wrong. Because, you've got Rahab in the Old Testament who lies about hiding somebody, isn't it? And that's sort of very key to the line of Jesus. And so if you might not get the line of Jesus if Rahab hadn't lied, and there's other stories like that. Yeah. And so people have thought that actually, yes, if I pretend to be Paul, in the mindset of the writer, I mean, not the fact that the community did condemn it. So you have this tension between both sides. But the writer in his mindset may have thought, if I get this truth out, it's not going to be heard unless I pretend to be Paul. And Paul said this back then in a letter, which I'm pretending to write on his behalf. they feel justified that if this brings salvation and healing by telling the truth in the letter about truth, but actually lying about who you are, it was worth it. And so that's the ethos that seems to be in some of the authors' minds.
I've got a question before we finish, and that's about the whole role of orthodoxy. Because if orthodoxy is a key criterion for a book to be included in the canon, but what is orthodox is also being set by the books that the forgeries managed to get in. Because if people start believing that 2 Peter is correct by Peter, then the orthodox view is that the delay of Jesus is somehow fine. Which
yes.
Yes. And then so it's all kind of self-referential,
Yes.
It all comes around in a circle.
It is. It comes around in a circle. So basically those that are in power who are collating the books or they're getting read in the church and accepted, you suddenly begin to get this delay. That's why you get the tension between the imminent end times and sort of references to delay in Thessalonians and Peter, because things you're obviously getting later and people are struggling. So you want to have some letters that kind of reference delay all of a sudden,
Yeah.
It's argued that Matthew itself does it. Mark has no hint of delay in the whole end time apocalyptic scenario in Mark 16, I believe it is. Mark, whatever the passage is. 13, Mark 13. No delay at all. It's just imminent. Watch, watch the disciples watch. It's about to happen. Matthew has, and it goes off for a while and there was a delay and then he'll come back. And when he comes back, keep watch. So there's sort of delay language, like it might be a bit longer than we think now, know? And so even Matthew may have been adapting to this delay in its own literature as we move on, So we've looked at. I mean, just to sort of sum up, I suppose this whole subject, because we haven't sort of covered the others, massively majority of the critical historical scholars on the Bible would say that the pastoral letters, that's 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, are not written by Paul, and there's disagreement on whether it was 3 authors, 1 author that did the lot and all of that, and it goes on and on and on. But basically it projects itself to a later church time. It's the Greek words are 2nd century, way more than, just like Daniel has problems with its original language for the 6th century compared with the 2nd. It's the same thing. Yeah. So the pastorals are big ones that almost took closest to Peter, to be honest. And then we sort of whittled down to problems with Ephesians, Colossians, for sure. And 2 Thessalonians, probably the most 50% one. And then all of the others in the Bible, really, apart from Paul's 7, he wrote 7 by the evidence, evidently. But all the others are sort of either misattributed. That's not quite forgery, but it means that, Mark didn't write Mark, Matthew didn't write Matthew, Luke didn't write Luke, and John didn't write John. In the modern scholarship landscape, they were not the authors that the tradition put onto them, misattributed. So it's not quite forgery, but, so I'm just summing up here the big picture. And Revelation wasn't written by the traditional John.
I mean, to be fair to the Gospels, I mean, they don't pretend to be from the people that they're said to be. So I mean, it's sort of different from the letters, Yes. I mean,
it's not I Mark, and then we're saying it wasn't Mark. No, so they're not called forgeries in the same sense. They're called misattributed authorships. So It's not to blame the writer; it's to blame the church.
Yes.
The church wanted to put names to them, and they were
wanted
wrong.
to put authoritative names to them as well.
Yes, exactly. They wanted two of the disciples and they wanted the 2 best friends of Paul and Peter. Luke and Mark.
Yeah, they didn't want Fred Bloggs.
No.
Yeah. So here's something. I don't know if you've ever heard this. There was this council in Jerusalem in about AD 49-50 that's talked about in Acts, where they sorted out some doctrinal stuff and issued a sort of decree to the churches. Now, why is that document not scripture?
Why
is it lost?
Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, that opens up a whole pan of questions. We mentioned this earlier, didn't we? The letters.
Yeah. Because that's the same
mean,
date as Paul's letters, roughly. And Paul's letters are preserved, and we, at Galatians, which clearly are, with all its dirty laundry, is sort of genuine.
Yes.
I mean, how do we know about the Apostolic Council? Where do we get that from?
I think Paul refers to it, and it's in Acts.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And Paul, in a genuine letter, refers to it.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that sort of thing raises big questions. You can go round and round and round on that, can't you? Can you lose scripture? Was the original ending of Mark cut off in the scroll, and we just lost it? So you've lost inspired scripture that's somewhere buried in the sand.
Yeah.
So there's all these questions. When you get to theology, you start to have problems. It's not when you get to history and how people write and lose stuff and make mistakes and forge. It all makes sense. It's when you have theology of pristine, Holy Spirit inspired texts, that's where you get problems. Somebody could have made a mistake, knocked the ink over, had to rush out, or the Romans were coming or something, so you can't finish the scroll and say, well, just put that in and have the end there. Don't worry, somebody in the 2nd century will tack on a new ending, it'll be okay. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
so it's like, that's real life though, isn't it? So there is some genuality to that. It's when you have the Holy Spirit is pristine and inerrant on everything in the text, including the authors who they say they were. That's where we get problems. So again, theology causes problems, not necessarily history. Anyway, so we have...
And when you take all the stuff from Paul that wasn't, that's not considered genuine, and you just got the pure Paul, does he become quite nice suddenly? And women don't have to keep quiet in church
to women, because even in 1 Corinthians, it's the bit about women there not allowed to speak in church or whatever is actually a verse that seems to be in different places and thrown around a bit. Doesn't seem to fit the context, and so it's possible that if that's interpolations from later authors, let's say, wrote 1 Timothy, where it's all not Paul, and very very down on women being in church leadership, it makes a lot of sense. Actually, Paul does make a lot of sense without these extra writings who had people speaking for him in a more patriarchal way, and
Aquila and Priscilla and there's called Juno or something, one of Paul's letters, and so they're all much more hippie dudes.
Yes, much more early. And the structure of the church as well was in Corinthians is all over the place in terms of every man for himself or every woman for himself, and they're just all speaking. And he needs to calm the chaos down by saying, don't all speak at once in tongues and stuff. And yet when you get to the pastorals, it's this leader that keeps it all in order, and it does seem to presuppose a much more structured setup of houses and almost a Roman structure, it's argued, by the time we get to the pastorals. And it just hints at very little mention about the second coming, and it's all about the day-to-day and the long haul and how to bring up the next generation, which wasn't really Paul. He was like, don't even get married, for goodness sake. And yet in the pastorals, he says, now women, I want you to get married. This is a different Paul, if it is Paul. So one has to do something with something here. You can't just sit there and say it's all fine. So anyway, very enjoyable.
Great. Yep. Sorry.
No, fantastic. Any last questions, Francis, seeing as that this is one subject that you've not been fully sort of aware of in detail, and you've researched it now a bit more.
Subject.
Well,
it's one subject.
It's the one subject that you've
everything else. Only subject that I
everything
don't know
else. You're like
about.
the master.
Yes,
master.
I am.
No.
Yes.
Okay, but in this subject, how have you? Just to sum up, from a person from the outside who's realised that this is now yet another rung in the ladder of problems with the New Testament and Christianity. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I suppose perhaps it would be interesting for me at some point to go back to the New Testament and read just the books that the experts say. What is it? 7 books, is it? Just those 7 books.
Yeah.
And just see where that leads to. I mean, it does sound as if the whole project is becoming dangerously thin when you've sifted out the not unreliable bits from it. You're not left with much, are you?
I'd like to do that. Actually, read just the 7 and see the feel from them, and then suddenly read Ephesians, and you think, "Oh my gosh, it's a different guy," you know. And and like you said, once the only thing that people hang themselves on is this sort of secretary thing, and it gets to the point where they, like I said right at the beginning of the podcast, oh yeah, I'm a bit ill today. Can you just write it? You know my theology. And no, I don't actually, Paul. I think it changes from my observation anyway. So what do you think now about the end times? Because before you said it was like any day, and so even that makes problems, with the secretary doing all of this stuff. So
yes, and you are hard to understand sometimes, Paul, and I wouldn't want any ignorant and unstable people to distort something that I might say on your behalf.
Brilliant. And then I'll get the blame down in history. Yes. Oh, it's a secretary that did this. It's not me. That secretary was so sort of against women, changing my words there, just when I went out for whatever you went out for then.
A McDonald's.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, it's just like, it's fraught when you think about it. You're absolutely right. It's fraught with problems. Just even thinking on the secretary hypothesis, it's called. And that's the last refuge that fundamentalists, is probably the only one that they go to be honest. These dear secretaries, they do get it. But anyway, right. Well, until we've looked at forgery in the early church and in the Bible, and anybody listening may be completely shocked by what you've heard, may have touched into it, may be wanting to go away and think, I'm going to look at this and show these guys they're wrong. Well, please go and research the subject and see what you come up with, as I have done in the past and as we have all done here. So, Ed, for next time.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate that a lot. And it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me, Francis.
And it's goodbye from me, Andrew. And until next time.